It's my absolute pleasure to welcome Andrew Chakhoyan to the channel once again. This will be our third recorded conversation. And in the past, I've shared a lot of his writings and articles because I feel they are some of the most penetrating and incisive on the issues that we're discussing. He is Ukrainian American based in the Netherlands and is a vocal and articulate champion of Ukraine and its cause, especially through some major publications such as Newsweek, Politico, and so on. We are going to be talking about geopolitics, but this is the first in our series of Ukrainian Advent calendar. So we're going to kick the conversation off by discussing his choice of the book, the film, and the work of art that has in his view, the greatest impact, and to understand the current conflict that's going on, has perhaps, important kind of symbolism in that. We're going to be doing the same with guests throughout December. We're going to be doing at least 25, probably quite a lot more, with significant Ukrainian voices. And then we're going to collate all of these votes, as it were, for their favorite and second favorite in these three categories. And then we're going to do a special episode where we explore these and hopefully introduce Western audiences to extremely powerful books on or about Ukraine or by Ukrainians, works of art and films. And that is certainly something people can follow up in and immerse themselves, not just in the political issues, but the deeper cultural atmosphere that sits behind the current war. It's a current war, the war that's been going on for several hundred years, in fact, between Russian imperialism and Ukrainian identity. Andrew, that was a very long introduction. Welcome to the channel.
Thank you so much, Jonathan. I'm glad to be back.
Well, let's start with your choice of book and then, the runners-up in that, because you've provided, I think, a really powerful set of recommendations. But I'll hand over to you to sort of talk about why you chose these books, and then we'll tackle the film and the work of art.
Super. As I read the instructions, I was imagining that I could just go with books and then leave the film and art to others. But I
I'm going
know
to
I think
press you on those because there must be something, even if it's a personal level, that really moves you. And yeah, I'd love to hear that. But let's tackle the books first.
super. No, I wanted to start with maybe the obvious. Sergei Plakhy, everybody who follows Ukraine should be reading his work. He's one of the sharpest minds on giving context to what's happening or where everything comes from. And the seminal work is Gates of Europe. I've read the Russo-Ukrainian War. I think everyone who follows your channel would be able to read the book and relate to it, but still, even though as you turn through the pages, you know what's going on, but it's still helpful to have it in one place. But those are obvious. I think there are a lot of Ukrainians, and some of them you invited to be on your channel. But they're not widely known as Sergei Blachy affiliated with Harvard. So I wanted to give a shout out to Maxim Aristavi, who's a Georgian Ukrainian, me being Armenian, Jewish Ukrainian in the Netherlands with my US citizenship. But Maxim Aristavi, he wrote a very good guide called Russian Colonialism 101. An absolute treasure. So I would recommend it to everybody. Olesya Khromenchuk, who is
It's on here. It's somewhere on the shelf. I can't quite spot it, but I have that volume. And Maxim's been on the channel twice. You say he's an incredible voice, actually, an incredible activist. Also, a sort of very active sort of activist for gay rights as well in Ukraine, and a leading journalist on Russian imperialism. Just for people's context, there, this volume is available in English, so do check it out if you can find it to purchase.
yeah, no, I have my English copy. Not some books I end up reading in Ukrainian, some in English. But Olesya Khromenchuk, she's in London, so she's in the UK.
She's in Vienna now. She's just on a placement, I believe. Not a secret 'cause she posted it publicly at the Imperial War Museum affiliate, and she's doing a project out there in Vienna. So if anyone's there, they could bump into her, I'm sure.
Yeah, and her book is The Death of a Soldier Told by His Sister. So it's in the title, but it's a personal account, and if you take Blahi's book, it's history, it's a big picture, whereas hers is heartfelt and personal. Alexander Mehed, I believe he's also in the UK. I don't know if you had him
He
join.
visits, yes, twice, of
Yeah.
course.
Uh,
He's been here for a number of events. He comes for a lot of book launches and events, and he's a very articulate, very sort of, I'd say, incisive and humorous speaker in the English language. I don't think he resides here permanently, from what I could tell. I think his family are from the suburb of Bucha, so of course, at the center of Russia's invasion way back in February 2022. But yes, he's over here a lot, just as Andrei Kurkov and others are, helping to project Ukrainian culture here.
no, in his book is The Language of War is the one I've read. I think his Come Out was another one. And then you mentioned Bucha, and it's quite central to the account. It's a very powerful kind of merging facts. I think he wants to be very literal writer. He wants to put out information as it is, but also bring himself into it. And it's a must read. I think it's similar to Alessia's book. The Language of War is Alexander's. And the last one I recommend it without having read it, but I'm just absolutely convinced that Mariam Nayem, she's an Afghani Ukrainian, comes from a family where Mustafa Nayem is a known voice. He was one of the folks that the Euromaidan begins with. Her brother, the older brother, fought in the war and lost his eye. But she like Maxim Aristavi. Her topic is Russian colonialism, Russian imperialism, and I have her book in Ukrainian, and I think the English version is due to come out early in 26. A brief history of a lone war. She's absolutely brilliant, bright, young person, and just following her work, I can't recommend her enough as a voice to follow.
And her brother is certainly an interesting character, as you say, and his central role in Maidan and the protests and then civic society thereafter. Well, that's a fantastic list, and I think combined that gives an extraordinary insight into what's been going on. I'm proud to say that this series of Ukrainian Advent interviews is supported by the Steel Porcupine, a unique and powerful film about a country that refuses to lie down, a people who turn themselves into a fortress of needles when Russian tanks rolled in. The Steel Porcupine is an unforgettable cinematic experience that exposes Russia's campaign of extermination in Ukraine and the Ukrainian people's spirit to resist and prevail. It follows soldiers, volunteers, and ordinary people who decided that survival meant resistance, not submission. Introduced by Nate Vance, a former US Marine who fought for 3 years in Ukraine's defense, this documentary moves from the Bucha massacre to genocide endorsing Russian state propaganda media. The Steel Porcupine is a love letter to Ukraine and a battle cry. It is free to watch and has already had a great impact on policymakers as well as activists. There is, of course, a link in the description of this video and in the comments as well. You can get to the website where you can see both the trailer and the film for free. Created by the makers of the acclaimed To the Zero Line, this is another film about humanity that clearly states there is no such thing as neutrality when war crimes are being committed systematically by Russia and on a scale in Europe only comparable to World War II. Set to a haunting soundtrack featuring music by Philip Glass and blending rare archival footage with original material. It is an impactful work of art and storytelling, as well as being informative. I strongly recommend you watch it, but even the trailer itself is compelling.
I feel terrible about it because Ukraine is a very important country, and I feel a personal stake because I got them to agree to give up their nuclear weapons, and none of them believe that Russia would have pulled this stunt if Ukraine still had their weapons. And I believe the Europe and the United States should continue to support Ukraine. There may come a time when the Ukrainian government believes that they can think of a peace agreement they could live with, but I don't think the rest of us should cut and run on them.
We are going to talk a little bit actually about the mechanics of Russian imperialism and indeed the impulse behind it. Before we do, though, just off the top of your head, what would be the most impactful film, Ukrainian film, or it could be a film about Ukraine, and work of art?
So let me think of a film first. So the one that I think is a hard one to watch. It's a arts kind of original. It's so the name I had to look it up. What's it in English? Тени забытых предков is the original title, but it's Shadows of Forgotten Ancestors. This comes from I'm trying to remember if it's Parajanov. So he's a Georgian, Armenian, Ukrainian. But it's considered within the art history. It's one of those influential masterpieces that kind of reverberates around. It's not a widely watched film, but it's a jewel in terms of artistic expression. Have you heard of it, Jonathan?
I have. I've seen little clips and snippets of it, but I've never watched the whole thing. But I think now is the time to do so. And they use the Christmas break to watch some of the things people nominate. But yes, it's considered something of an absolute classic, isn't it, or a
Exactly.
foundational movie in the canon.
Yeah. And the must-watch film, and I presume half of the people, maybe more, that follow your channel have seen it. It's 20 Days in Mariupol. It's yeah, I when I was walking out of the theater, I could not spot one person who wasn't crying. It's a very hard film to watch, but it's something we must watch and maybe even rewatch.
Definitely, I couldn't get through it on the first sitting. In fact, it took 6 attempts to watch it, but then I finally watched it all the way through. And he's got a new one, 1,000 meters from Avdiivka, sorry. Um, that I'm waiting for that to come out. It's not on streaming as far as I can tell yet, but I think that'll coming out in the next couple of weeks. Another apparently extraordinary, impactful work. And even more so when you know that the director, that is his hometown. He's especially especially set it and filmed it there, and it coincided, of course, with with the battle that's going on. But then when you know that this is a place that's familiar to him, it has additional poignancy. That's I'm going to have a very long film list to watch. And then lastly is the artwork, and this is kind of a more complex one, isn't it? Because it has, over the last couple of decades, been a major issue, especially in international collections, that many Ukrainian pieces of art and artists have been appropriated by Russia and mislabeled and misunderstood.
No, it's suppressed is another word. Is the pillaging of all heritage. It's this crime is just not as visible because there's so many crimes that are happening in real time. But when Russia invaded, in every invasion, every time it had a chance, it would just steal the historical artifacts because it wants to take Ukraine's history. And I think we'll get to that topic in a conversation. I think it's quite deliberate. It's not none of it is accidental. It's just to take Scythian gold and take it from Ukraine to Moscow and say that's our heritage, is robbing Ukraine of history and appropriating it. This is absolutely deliberate. And the artist I wanted to mention, a quintessential Ukrainian artist whose work was suppressed, was banished, and then her museum was bombed deliberately, as far as I can tell, is Maria Primachenko. Her art is, how we all know of Picasso because he's introduced this new way of painting. She's, if if she was in Paris at this time, maybe she would have been more known than him. But she's absolutely unique style, very moving. It's not known. Like her name is not known, but she deserves as much recognition as any of the folks who've shaped modern art in the way that it is. But Maria Primachenko, I do definitely recommend her work.
There we go. I'll chop that out. Yes, there was an extraordinary exhibition of her works in London over the summer, and was it last summer? I lose the track of time. But it really makes an impact when you see them all collected together, and of course the extraordinary vibrant colors of those artworks. If I'm not mistaken, her house was destroyed, or is that a different artist?
Right,
Down in
exactly. No,
Kakhovka, Stara Kakhovka,
that's right.
Nova Kakhovka. Now let's dive into the geopolitical issues, and I think let's start with you put forward this idea that, of course, much of what we've been concentrating on when we talk about Russia is how to contain it, how to push back, how to deal with the aggression that comes out, but far less conversation about the source of that aggression, why it feels the need, why it's compelled to attack its neighbors, to endlessly push beyond its borders, which is a defining feature actually of the 19th and especially 20th centuries, and now, of course, is a defining feature of the 21st century as well. Could you extrapolate on that, why it's important, and actually deconstruct what you think those motivations are that compel this endless outward aggression?
No, that's thank you for starting with this. I feel like we get so stuck in the daily headlines. It's almost like there's so much that goes on and we have to hold on to it and know what to think, know what to do. But we need to step back and ask a really big question. Why Russia is the way that it is, why Russia does what it does. And so, you and me and probably everybody on this channel has been accused of quote unquote Russophobia. And Russophobia is an accusation you get for ever talking about Russian lies, talking about Russian war crimes, talking about the through line from Mongolian Khans to the governance system out of Moscow, because it's a continuation. It's not the Russian story is there was this marvelous place, then the Mongols invaded, and then they fought them off, and the marvelous place was reborn. That's not at all true. It's not at all how it went. It's just there was nothing there. There were the outpost on the edge of a Kievan Rus, a thriving civilization. It was floodlands of Moskva River, and then eventually that outpost was collecting taxes for Mongols. That's the genesis story of Russia, and that's the one we must learn. But as soon as you talk about it, suddenly you're Russophobe. Suddenly you are, all but the eugenicist. You're blaming Russians for being, terrible people. It's not. There's nothing genetically wrong with any with a Russian person. A Russian newborn is just as innocent, just as any other newborn anywhere, but they're born into Russian culture. They're born into Russian context, and this context in which they grow up forms their worldview, forms their kind of sense of themselves and sense of destiny. And that needs to be explored, needs to be understood. Because if we think, like, you've heard this many times, is this Putin invaded Ukraine. If only this evil, terrible man wasn't there, then things would just suddenly go straight back to normal. I have my sister, I talk with her, and she keeps bringing that up, saying, "Oh my goodness, this Putin, when will he die?" But what's going to change if we don't ask the question why Russia does what it does? And my sense, the more I read and think about it, is the wars choose themselves. The Russia wages war by default. The decision to invade Ukraine it made itself, and then Putin was appointed to wage it. I don't want to take responsibility from him either. He's both the driver, the agent, but also the instrument of Russian history. The history, the wheels of history are turning, and whether it was Putin, anyone else, Yeltsin, the quintessential Russian Democrat, he invaded Chechnya, Ichkeria. It's just what Russia does, and until we drill in and understand that why, what's the root, and until we have a serious conversation as to what drives that place, why it's this way, then we can have policies that will be meaningful. Because then we will be, putting a band-aid on a avalanche. I don't know. It just we will then miscalibrate. Our response will be incommensurate with the situation. But that's why I feel like that's a place to start every conversation.
And I think you point out something really fascinating, which it is systemic. And I think this is very difficult to get across, isn't it? And it happens when you talk about corruption as well, whereas corruption being incidental to the Ukrainian system, it's something that you need to deal with as if you would, deal with, let's say a skin complaint, for example. It's not intrinsic to the body, but it's something that affects the body. Whereas corruption and nepotism are part of the very structure of the Russian state. What drives it? What are the economic drivers as well of this imperial mechanic, as it were?
Yeah, so you're calling from UK. So UK was the richest empire at the time, right? And where did the riches come from? Came from the colonies, right? As you have the trade with India, and suddenly the London is a thriving city that benefits from its colonies. Moscow is this way today, yesterday, a century ago. It never existed any other way. All the wealth is in Siberia. All the rich people are in Moscow because it's an extractive, uh, blood-sucking system, right? It's just like all the Russians are told by the center, by the imperial, by the metropole, saying, uh, uh, bow to the czar. Again, doesn't matter. Is it czar, commissar, or kleptocrat like Putin? It doesn't matter. Is it mafia boss? Who cares? As long as that person sits there in the center, then everybody must bow, and then that means that all the riches will concentrate in Moscow, and everybody else will be, given some dreams of greatness. Back in the day, it would be serfdom or slavery is another good word for it, and things don't really change because as soon as you abandon serfdom, then what? Then you need to remind people why this whole you know, what is it, six time zone, nine time zone thing? Why is it all together? You need to be re-legitimizing Moscow because the Moscow wants to suck the blood out of its colonies, out of Siberia, out of North Caucasus, out of Republic Sakha, or like doesn't matter. The riches are out there in the colonies. We call them oblast or provinces of the Russian Federation or federation subjects. Forget it. Like all those places are colonies. They're people who've been uh, colonized, their identities being erased or are being actively erased, and and that economic system is the only one. The Russia doesn't know any other system. It cannot create new wealth, and in a way, this system stands in the way of progress. Like Russia can't advance because it's locked into it. It's locked into this imperial architecture.
Of course, to keep this structure together, I mean, it needs to give out the sense of being strong, being inevitable. We see these kind of narratives coming through in the war against Ukraine as well. But ultimately, it seems to be quite a brittle structure that relies on extreme heavy-handedness, a massive secret police, an army. Doesn't rely necessarily on efficiency, but it does rely on sort of massive coercion and fear. Um, and also, could you comment on the idea that humiliation plays a role? Because it seems to me that there are certain bits of glue that hold this structure together. And it's a vertical structure, not a horizontal, which Ukraine is often compared to as more of a horizontal. What are the mechanics of the architecture that hold this vast, diverse land empire together to benefit a small number of people, as you point out, are mostly in Moscow or consuming those resources in Moscow?
It's a good question to ponder is how does the system work? So, this quote from Solzhenitsyn, if I remember, is they're lying. We know they're lying. They know that we know that they're lying, and they continue to lie. But let's explore what that means. It means that people are being humiliated, right? Because if we take this phrase as it is, this humiliation is central, right? If I'm being lied to, I know it, and I go on with my day being lied to. That establishes the relationship. What like can Russia have citizens? What's a citizen? Citizenship comes with responsibilities and rights. You can't have rights without taking responsibility. And so because of this humiliation cycle, it's like we it's always easy to take one side of it to say it's the Kremlin putting pressure on the Russian people. The Kremlin is evil, everybody's fine, and then the Kremlin is terrible, oppressive, has propaganda. But it's you mentioned the word corruption. Corruption is a two-way street. Somebody takes bribes, somebody gives bribes. With humiliation, two-way street. Somebody dishes out humiliation, somebody else takes it. Ukrainians, look at Euromaidan. What was Yanukovych doing? Humiliating Ukrainians, taking their dignity away. People showed up and died. Like they showed up with wooden shields and they came in knowing that they will die this day because they will have to storm, the well-armed killers, and they were willing to do it, willing to show up and sacrifice in mass. Where in Russia, let's not say every single person, right? Of course, they're heroes, they're brave characters, and so, but where's that culture? Is there a tradition embedded in the culture where you say we will not be humiliated? You go to serfdom, right? Is you have no agency that the czar will tell the subjects, right? Subjects are subjects, no agency. You are property, and then eventually serfdom is abandoned or like gone, right? What changed? Has anything changed? Because in Europe, when you have monarchies collapsing, then people took power and established democratic tradition. In Russia, none of this ever happened because the impetus to drive towards this kind of change, it wasn't like it's really hard to pin down why was that revolution in Russia led to yet another totalitarian system? Is it do you blame the people? I go back to the very fundamental question, what Russia is and what does that mean to be Russian? And so you cannot, in my latest new idea is you cannot be a Russian nationalist at all. You cannot be a nationalist because you have no nation. You can be Russian imperialist. And by saying a Russian nationalist, you are meaning you will defend the empire, and by defending it, you will demand its expansion. That means Russian national. But you could be a Dutch national because Dutch had built their culture, their nation, and then expanded into empire. There was the period when the nation was getting built. I live in the Netherlands. I see Dutch people. There must have been pre-imperialist Dutch and the post-imperialist Dutch. Russians cannot enter any of those spaces at all because from day one, the only Russia that ever existed is the imperialist Russia. And then to me, this whole thing is central to this question of why the society, like you cannot blame people and say, why aren't you going and with pitchforks to the Kremlin and then dying? Why won't you do it? Like, if I were living in that place, would I go with pitchfork to die? Doubtful, right? But the system itself how will it ever get dismantled? It's locked into this colonial structure. It's just stuck, and until this is understood, it's almost like Kasparov. He makes that argument saying that decentralization, but almost as soon as you start being a real opposition voice saying Russia needs to evolve, needs to become something else, you have to accept that the only way it will ever happen if the empire disintegrates. Until that happens, there can be no progress. The reason you don't have mass protests is because there is no national interest. And this humiliation is a systemic because it keeps the country together. It creates Russia. This humiliation dished out and humiliation accepted. It creates that thing that we refer to as Russia. It creates that whole thing, that this system or whatever we call it. It's yeah.
And is there another problem here in that we tend to look at Russia and analyze it from a framework of our own Western evolution of our political and industrial and social systems? So when we look at things like communism, we look at Russianism or Russian nationalism. Now, I won't go back to the Tsarist period because it gets very complicated and it's easy to say things that are too simplistic because there was some emergence, let's say, of civic society and far more plurality in the early 20th century than there was post 1917. But let's just stick with the communist period. In some senses, industrialization, communism, and even the current wave of nationalism, they're not bottom-up, organic movements. They're emerging from social, economic, and political processes. They are all efforts by a regime to impose some form of ideology and narrative from the top down to achieve their political and economic ends or their power and resource ends, actually. But we often will look at Russian nationalism as an organic phenomenon when actually there's something it seems quite artificial about it.
No, it's I like this term re-legitimation exercise or under every regime, what needs to happen is you need to re-legitimize the Moscow-centric system. And you cannot call it Moscow-centric system. You call it, a Soviet Union or whatever. It's this exploitative, extractive model that centers on Moscow. That's an important pillar of all of this. And then you have the word I like is agentlessness of the population. You want population with no agency. And under every monarch, you kind of wanted that as well. This is like most countries when you have a system of governance, you'd want subordination and so on. But in Russia, this agentlessness is very important. And then you need stories, you need storytelling to assure it stays this way. To take agency from the people, but give them something instead. So under Soviet times, it would be the Soviet ideology, the communism we were all built in and how we're all brothers. You had Third Rome under Tsarists, and one of the difficulties was Putin, and there's the ideology, like the story isn't there. The big story he's selling is this вставание с колен, is this Russia rising from its knees, or победобесие, is this Russia is this savior of the world because Russia defeated Nazis.
It's this divinely anointed civilizational force, I think you've described it as.
Yeah, yeah. You need this Russian greatness. You need something, but his stories are not as potent as or maybe there are too many, or they're not just under Putin. Russians had this misfortune of becoming rich. So if people are rich, then they start expecting different things. But well, for Russian system to function, you needed something else. You need folks to be again treated as serfs, never understanding the idea of citizenship, that you actually do have power. You just have to recognize you have it. Taking it is a derivative. You cannot demand that democratic system, meaning accountability to the people, until people gain agency. And it has to be every individual and society together. So on one hand, Putin's rule, he cemented his rule because oil prices went up, and then he was a popular semi-democratic leader early on, but he was using that to reinstall the traditional system. But then, as people got richer, he needed to put that story back into the discourse of you know rising from the knees, and making sure that expectations have not changed. Expectations must remain the same, and the social contract once again is you have Tsar in the center, Moscow centric system. The biggest number of billionaires per capita of any city in the world was Moscow, and you had that, and then everybody else had to be a serf, and that was the expectation. Like if that starts breaking down, Russia starts breaking down.
And in that pattern as well, you've talked about aggression being not merely something that occurs with a great regularity, but something that is absolutely structural. That this system, this vertical, actually requires outward expansion. It requires the sort of control that, let's say, mobilization imposes on the population. A reminder that life is red in tooth and claw, not to expect comfort and liberty and rights. But also, it seems there is something fundamentally parasitic about that structure, which compels it to aggression. It's a phrase I've used before is it's hardwired for aggression, not genetically, but it's how the machine is built.
No, it's central to the culture, to the governance system, to the societal norms, to set of values. It's not. No one's saying that there's value of violence, right? People sit there and then they think, what do we value? Is it aggression? No, but it's inherent in the definition of what Russia is. And because you start again saying there was never a nation, there's no national interest. The interest, Russia's national interest diverged from the interest of the people. Are people interested in going and dying in Ukraine? Is that the interest of the people? Is that the interest of the people for Putin to say we did rise from the knees by killing a bunch of people whom we called brothers yesterday? Is that in the interest of anyone? Are people in Siberia interested in pumping all the oil out of the ground and remaining poor without sanitation and a working toilet? Like there's those divergence of interest is to be expected because you don't have a nation. You have the empire, and then you have a basic mechanism of empire. They're either expanding or collapsing. They're not a stable empire makes no sense because you then wake up and every single day you say, "Oh, we are an empire. We're stable. Things are calm." This absolutely bonkers clip of Putin where he's given some kind of speech and says, "Движуха" is this really strange Russian word. Is this idea of motion, commotion? Like we need that, or else if we're stale, then things not good for Russia. So in a way, he recognizes this very urge is this you need to be invading, or else what are we here to do? People will in Dagestan will wake up and wonder why is the oil that we're pumping benefits all those folks in Moscow? What are we doing? Like they need to re-legitimize Moscow as this blood-sucking central node and to which everybody must bow. And therefore, Moscow will defend you, the Russian subjects, by invading somebody else. So you think they're the enemy, they're the threat, so must invade. And it's this good satirical account on Twitter that Darth Putin says Russia has an interesting way of always defending itself in other people's countries. It's but that's it. It has to do it for the purpose of legitimizing Moscow, not Putin, not communism. No, the Moscow-centered system, and that's key.
And of course, well, we won't necessarily get on to culture as a topic, although we did start with Ukrainian culture, which is incredibly important. But it seems that everything is a tool, everything becomes a tool and a weapon, because in a system where essentially all resources are dispensed at the largesse of the state, and they're given out to people who are useful and beneficial to the state, and increasingly large amounts of resources require you to be to have a exponentially important role in the state in projecting its values, but right down to sort of, people in the street or working in entertainment, media, etc. There's a clear understanding, it seems, that everything flows from the state. And if you don't exhibit loyalty and conformity, well, you'll be cut off from those resources. In some ways, it's very reminiscent of the communist system, which was absolutely like that. I mean, one of my books I find interesting. I don't want to promote Russian culture, but one of the books I find interesting is Moskva Petrushki, which was written by a dissident intellectual and alcoholic. He actually drank so much that he lost his voice box. It had to be operated on and taken out. But the idea there is that, and he worked as many dissident intellectuals did in Ukraine as they did in Russia. If you fell outside the system, then you would have to do things like collect bottles for recycling and make money on that. Probably work in what they call kotelnik, I think it was. You work in a boiler room, which is the sort of minimal wage. It's the lowest of the low, and you can be ignored and happily drink yourself into a coma there. But yeah, if you're cut off, if you cease to show loyalty, then the flow of resources stop. That seems to me fundamentally different from hopefully the way our societies are set up. Although, dare I say it, conformity is becoming more and more a demand of access to resources in parts of the West as well.
Yeah, it's no, I think this is a fair point. And then we started with artists, and so to that governance system, any independent thought is a threat, right? So exterminating uh, cultural elites or folks who can contribute fresh ideas was the Russian way, and the Розстріляне відродження is the executed Renaissance. I think you featured it on your podcast. It's the recurring story, it's Stalin executing anyone and everyone in circles. As soon as somebody shows up with some new ideas or whatever, suddenly that's a threat. Because I, I'm not going to give it justice, but I think Timothy Snyder explained how Russia governs without the future, because future it cannot offer because it's not available. So it governs from the sense of like, looking back at 1945 or whatever, just offering some kind of stories that don't look forward. They simply can't because you've first of all exterminated everyone, and second of all, if you didn't, then we'll start offering new vision. But in that vision, this monstrosity, this Frankenstein federation cannot exist. It just can't because it makes no sense for people to express their culture. For say folks in Tatarstan who are Muslim who had their own language, they're told, no, you're Russians. You need uh, uh, Volodymyr Yermolenko uses, I think, as a very important word, the sameness is the way of expanding your empire is not to show up and say, now you report to me. I'm superior, you're inferior. Not that. The Russian Empire shows up and says, now you are me. Now all of you are us, and be Russian. If you're not willing to be Russian, then then the gun to your head, right? And then, but how can that culture in Tatarstan flourish? It needs to self-express. It needs to discover uh, who the people are, what they see for themselves, what's their future. But themselves becomes that threat to the Moscow-centric system.
And this is what I find fascinating about Ukraine. What I see of the culture is that it's imbued with hope, which itself has to look to the future, but it's also it's an exploration of the future because within that you have cooperation, trust, experimentation, you have risk taking, and you have change, and all these things I think are intrinsically threatening to a rigid autocracy that has, as you say, a backwards looking thing. So this is the last area of focus here, and I think it brings it together in the absolute fundamental differences between how Ukrainian culture is evolving since the Iron Curtain came down, and how Russia's culture seems to be far more the picking of a very old scab to keep it fresh, bleeding and oozing pus, to use a very graphic image there. But is there some truth in this? And does this help perhaps to explain why Putin particularly felt that the aggression at this point in history should be expressed towards Ukraine and not to another one of its neighboring states?
No, I've been to me there's been a topic that I wanted to learn about, and that's why I read Plahi's books, Snyder's. I feel like answering that very question. And so the most compelling argument that resonates with me is Russia's very essence is built on a identity theft, on a foundational perjury. We call this place around Moscow, the nine time zones, we call it Russia. But where's the word came from? It was stolen from Kiev and Rus, right? It was appropriated. But when you appropriate the name, why would you do that? Why would a czar in the Kremlin wanted to call this thing that he was running Rus rather than Moscovia? Why was that important? Because he didn't want the story of where the descendants of the Mongolian tribute system, right? Here's a center, collect taxes, iron fist, and that was not a great story. And the neighbors further west had national myths and so on. So Russia stole Ukraine's myth and appropriated it. I think identity theft is a good language for it. Is as soon as you do that, and then the person whose identity you stole and you kept suddenly gains agency and then wants to live its own life, and so that becomes a threat because then you be exposed as a fraud. If Ukraine, like, let's imagine the future, just abstract ourselves again from day to day and say Ukraine, there's no war, gets governed by better and better governance, the innovative culture and so on, and finds itself in Europe where it belongs, lives a life just like the Dutch folks, rich, prosperous, forward-looking. In that story, how could Russia exist still? It cannot, because Ukraine that owns its narrative, Ukraine that moves forward, exposes the emptiness of the Russian myth that the word Rus will have to be reclaimed. Because by going forward, rebuilding what Ukraine always was, but it had pressure coming from the neighbors where the Kievan Rus was under Moscow or under Poland or Lithuanian kingdom and so on. It was interesting because it was kind of self-assured in who they were, and then those who came to conquer were stronger, but not necessarily demanding that Ukraine stop being Ukraine. So in a way, even if you report to from Kiev to some other capital, it didn't take your Ukrainianness away. So the culture persevered, except for the Russian pressure, where there was de-Ukrainization. There were various efforts trying to root out that the national ethos. But Ukraine gaining agency, gaining nationhood that is recognized by Ukrainians and outside is a huge threat to Russia storytelling, to this legitimacy of Moscow not calling the country, Moscovia Empire that conquered Siberia and whatever, rather than instead calling itself Russian Federation, right? So I think this is an important bit of insight that again is missed. And there are many ways to interpret it. I think if you're a professional historian, you will end up caveating this left and right because, back in the days, no nations existed. There was city-states, right? It's all true. But to me, as kind of looking at this foundational perjury in the Russia storytelling and governing from the past and explaining to itself why it exists, it needs that myth that it stole.
I think that's a perfect place to end. And of course, it reminds us why we're doing this series, which is to explore Ukrainian identity, culture, and history through books, art, and film, and to understand that there is a fundamental difference between Ukraine and Russia, a fundamental difference as to why they fight, why Ukraine must survive, and why Russia clearly wants to erase the things that we are nominating. I hope that is both a dark but also an uplifting topic and that people will get value from the series. Andrew, I'm delighted that we kick this off with you and absolutely excellent choices. I think that has set the tone for the future episodes that are coming. I hope people get value from it.
Thank you so much, Jonathan. Slava Ukraini.
Героям слава.
Ukrainian people and the Ukrainian military have been underestimated for a period of several years now. And ultimately, I'm convinced from my reflections in observing from an intelligence standpoint that they will fight with their bare hands if they have to, if they don't have terms that are acceptable to an enduring peace.
So this is a design for a 3D printed drone frame. The engines are mounted here. The drone motors are mounted here, here, and here. What I can do is export these shapes into the slicer.
This film has absolute moral clarity. It does not both sides the war. It does not use neutral language. This is a film that says clearly who invaded whom, who is killing whom, and who is standing on their own land, fighting back, showing why Ukrainians will bleed for every meter. This film is not meant to comfort you. It's meant to arm you with clarity, with solidarity, and with the stubborn, spiky hope that democracies can still fight back and win.
Children are not stupid. They're just small, right? They're just small versions of us. They know exactly who the threat is. There's almost no families within Ukraine who have not lost a family member or have had a family member maimed by Putin and his army.
We have to put Ukraine in a position of strength, that it has the means to fortify and protect itself from the economic survival to the military resilience. It's basically turning Ukraine into a steel porcupine that is indigestible for potential invaders.
Putin was super clear when he started this war that the existence of Ukraine as a sovereign and free country was an unacceptable affront to Russian security. He will not stop until Ukraine isn't a country anymore.
Poets have spent their entire lives trying to explain the horrors of war. I am no poet. Anyone who has seen what I have seen would probably think differently about the situation in Ukraine and what the Russians are doing.